Hello, chess enthusiasts! Welcome back to the Chess Ventura channel. In today's video, I'll be diving into a fascinating chess game featuring two legendary players of their time, Mikhail Tal and Bobby Fischer. The match took place during the 1959 tournament, where these two titans faced each other 4 times. Remarkably, Mikhail Tal emerged victorious in all 4 encounters. Without further ado, let's jump straight into the game. Here, Bobby Fischer plays as white, while Mikhail Tal takes the black pieces. The game begins with pawn to e4, and Tal responds with pawn to c5, choosing the Sicilian defense. Fischer replies with knight to f3, preparing to push the pawn to d4. In the Sicilian defense, black has 3 main options: pawn to d6, knight to c6, or pawn to e6. In this game, Tal chooses pawn to d6 and Fischer counters with pawn to d4, leading to the open Sicilian variation. Tal captures the pawn with pawn takes pawn, and Fischer recaptures with knight takes pawn. Then, Tal develops his knight to f6, attacking the central pawn on e4. Fischer responds with knight jumps to c3, defending the e4 pawn. Finally, Tal plays pawn to a6. When playing the Sicilian defense, advancing the pawn to a6 is crucial. The purpose of this move is to prevent white's bishop or knight from occupying the b5 square. This specific variation is known as the Najdorf variation. Fischer continues his development with bishop to c4, preparing for kingside castling. Mikhail Tal responds with pawn to e6. White then moves bishop to b3, and black develops his bishop to e7. In this position, white would typically castle kingside immediately. However, Fischer opts for a more aggressive approach with pawn to f4. In response to this move, Mikhail Tal secures his king by castling kingside. Fischer then moves his queen to f3, and Tal replies with queen to c7. White follows up by castling kingside. Tal begins an expansion on the queen side with pawn to b5, aiming to push further and threaten the white knight on c3. In this position, white should have played pawn to a3 to prevent the pawn advance to b4. However, Fischer appears to act hastily by playing pawn to f5, allowing Tal to push pawn to b4, attacking the knight. If the white knight retreats and black pushes pawn to d5, the knight would become trapped with no safe squares to move to. To avoid this, Fischer moves his knight to a4. Tal capitalizes on the position by advancing pawn to e5, forcing the other white knight to retreat to e2. As we can see, both of Bobby Fischer's knights are in poor positions. One is stuck on the edge of the board at a4, while the other has become passive on the second rank at e2. However, after the pawn advances to e5, the d5 square becomes weak. Recognizing this, Mikhail Tal continues with bishop to b7. This move not only exerts control over the central d5 square but also increases pressure on white's central pawn at e4. Fischer attempts to reinforce the pawn by playing knight to g3. Tal follows with knight to d7, and white develops with bishop to e3. Tal then places his light-squared bishop on c6, further targeting the central squares. White responds with bishop to f2, and black moves his queen to b7, adding even more pressure on the e4 pawn. To defend the pawn, Fischer plays rook to e1. Tal counters with pawn to d5, increasing the assault on e4. White captures the pawn, and Tal recaptures with his knight, setting up a potential discovered attack on the white queen. To avoid this, Fischer plays knight to e4. Tal continues with knight jumping to f4, positioning it on a highly strategic square. This move also pins the white knight on e4 due to the black bishop's attack. In response, Fischer advances his pawn to c4, hoping that if black captures the pawn en passant, the white knight can recapture, reactivating the previously passive knight. Of course, Tal is not tempted to capture the pawn. Instead, he finds a brilliant move with pawn to g6. The threat here is to capture the pawn and attack the knight on d4. However, white prevents this by capturing the pawn first. Tal then plays pawn to f5, attacking the knight. In response, Fischer advances his pawn to g7, threatening the rook. Fischer's idea here is that after the king captures the pawn, he can move his queen to e3, delivering a check. Using this tempo, the knight on e4 can break free from the bishop's pin. Tal calmly responds with king to h8. Fischer follows up with knight to e5, attacking the queen and offering a knight exchange. Tal accepts the offer with knight captures knight, and Fischer recaptures with bishop captures knight. The exchanges continue as Tal plays bishop captures bishop with check, and Fischer replies with knight captures bishop, simultaneously attacking Tal's queen. Tal safely retreats his queen to c7, where it also defends the e5 pawn, which is under attack by white's rook. In this position, black has numerous threats to create. First, the rook can attack the queen while simultaneously increasing pressure on the g2 pawn. Additionally, the black queen indirectly threatens the knight on d5, enabling a potential discovered attack with the bishop capturing the g2 pawn. White responds by moving the queen to e3, both protecting the knight and increasing pressure on the e5 pawn. Tal counters by reinforcing the e5 pawn with rook to e8. It is clear that Mikhail Tal's pieces are incredibly active, especially the knight and bishop. Together, they exert significant pressure on the g2 pawn while also posing a dangerous fork threat to white's rook and queen. In this position, white's king is in a highly precarious situation. Let's analyze it step by step. If white tries to attack the knight by advancing the pawn, the knight can jump to h3, delivering a check. This forces the king to move to f1. Then, pawn to f4 threatens the queen, and after pawn captures pawn, the knight recaptures the pawn, setting up a discovered check on the next move. As you can see, the king's position becomes increasingly vulnerable. Now, let's return to the actual game. Recognizing the danger, Fischer plays rook to e2 to protect the g2 pawn. Tal responds by capturing the pawn with the knight, delivering a check. Fischer recaptures the knight with the queen, but then Tal's bishop captures a pawn, opening up an attack on the white knight by the black queen. Fischer, not wanting to lose his knight for free, captures the pawn with his queen, simultaneously threatening Tal's queen. Tal responds with queen to a2, delivering a check while threatening the knight. According to the computer, the best move for white here is to block the check with pawn to c5. However, Fischer makes a fatal error by capturing the bishop on g2. Tal seizes the opportunity and plays rook to g8, delivering a check. This move sets up a forced checkmate in 5 moves. At this point, white's king has only 4 options. Let's analyze them. If the king moves to f1, it's checkmate with rook to g1. If the king moves to h1, the black queen will check from b7. White can block with the queen, but regardless, it's checkmate with queen to g2. If the king moves to f3, black plays pawn to f4, forcing the king to f4. Then, queen to b6 sets up a mate threat on h6. If white tries to block with queen to h5, black's queen goes to f2 with a check. White must block with the queen, and black's queen captures it, delivering checkmate. Now, let's return to the actual game. Bobby Fischer moves his king to h3. Tal replies with queen to g7, threatening mate on h6. Fischer plays bishop to d1, preparing to support the queen in blocking the mate on h5. Tal counters with rook to e6, and here Fischer resigns. If the game had continued, for example, with king to h4, black would respond with rook to h6, delivering a check. If white blocks with the queen, black plays queen to g2. No matter what white does, checkmate is inevitable. For instance, if white's queen captures the rook, black's queen delivers checkmate with queen to h2. Alright, that's it for today's video. If you enjoyed this analysis, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support means a lot and keeps me motivated to bring you more exciting games. Thank you, and see you in the next video.